All right, this is your last one for the week. The only thing I really want to talk about here is just my pitch for why I think that this course, as well as kind of debate and argumentation and persuasion, are generally important things to study and should probably be emphasized more than they are in current educational structures. Um, Before I get to that part, the way that I think about this class is that it's trained to kind of make you do two different things. The first is obviously to be able to make arguments effectively, but the second, and I actually believe that this is the more important function, is for you to be able to analyze arguments effectively. And what I mean by that is hopefully one thing that you are getting already is that arguments are everywhere, right? They're not just when politicians are standing behind podiums, they're not just in formal debates, but they're in every article that you read, they're in every TV show that you watch, they're in pretty much every conversation that you have, which is why we'll be focusing on a lot of different kind of popular culture materials, etc., just so that you can understand that argument is all around you. That leads me to what I think is actually the most important reason for this class and argumentation in general. Some of you may have noticed the Harry Potter reference on the syllabus, which is that argumentation to me is defense against the dark arts. And I didn't make that up. That is something that a graduate school professor of mine named Sean Treat told us on the first day of grad school, and that's really stuck with me. And what that means to me is that when people go and try to do things that are bad in the world, and I do believe in the normative statement that there are bad things in the world, right? They almost always do so by making bad arguments that people feel kind of fail to analyze properly enough to the point where they realize they are bad arguments. And of course, the most classic example of this is Hitler, right? Who was democratically elected and made a bunch of bad arguments about why he should do bad things that he got people to buy into. And did he also persuade people through the use of weaponry, mass killings, etc.? Yes, of course, and that's extremely important. But the build up to that was literally him persuading people through bad forms of argumentation. So, one of my hopes in this class is that we can give you some of the tools that when people make bad arguments in the world, that you're able to recognize them and not just accept them implicitly. An example of when this could have been effective is there's this really famous rhetorician. He's a really famous dude in our field named Kenneth Burke, who is kind of a rock star of rhetoric. And he wrote in the 1930s that the Holocaust was going to happen because of the things that Hitler was saying based on his writings, using very traditional argumentation structures, and people just kind of laughed him off. And not to kind of toot the own horn of my field too much, right? I don't expect you all to go out and stop the next Hitler, but he was right and the field of argumentation was right. It was important to look at what a leader was saying and to try to generate an effective response to it, which people failed to do in the Hitler case. So that's the first thing. The second reason that I think that the class is important is that the ability to argue with people and disagree with them in a civil way is foundational to an effective democratic system. It is not possible to have democracy unless some of us disagree with each other. And we talked a little bit about how we can use rhetoric and argumentation to find versions of the truth, right? So I have a version of the truth, you have a version of the truth, we argue about it, and maybe we get to a better version. It is good that we don't all always agree with each other. I want to complicate this a little bit. The first is that everything that I just said is extremely Western, right? In the sense that It is not true that that is how all societies operate with argumentation. And we will have an element of kind of focusing on non-Western forms of argumentation later in the class. But for now, you should just know that I'm talking primarily about an American context here. The second is that civil discourse is not always the way to go when it comes to argumentation. Occasionally, I believe things like anger, rage, etc. are necessary components of that deliberation, but the focus of the class is how we can build argumentation skills so that we don't have to get to that point. But just so you know, I do think that sometimes those things are okay. The third is that you all, not just in a democratic society, but in your own lives, need to be able to advocate for yourselves. And maybe everything will go magically well for you in your own lives, whether that be interpersonally or in your careers, etc. But it's not always the case, and there will be a time in your life when you do need to advocate for yourself. So one area that I can think of is someone, I forget who at the moment, on the first day of class brought up the example of wage gaps in careers between men and women. I think that this class is a good example of how we can better train people to advocate against things like those wage gaps, not just in the context of places like Congress, right? But also just in your everyday lives, maybe in your interactions with your bosses. The kind of last thing that I want to say here is that when people hear the word argument, they almost always think of it as a negative term, right? You might think of arguments that escalate, you might think of arguments that turn physical, etc. Those arguments are bad, there's no doubt about that, but I want you to start thinking about argument, both in the context of this class and in general, as sometimes a positive thing, right? In your interpersonal lives, in your careers, that there can be times when disagreement is good, and that it's better to talk about those disagreements in a kind of polite and structured way. So I want you to reframe maybe your traditional notions of argument a little bit in order to be most successful both in this class and in your lives.